Hi, this is John Potter and welcome to session 10 of Leadership in Action. And in this session we're going to have a look at the foundations for effective operational and strategic leadership.
Session 10. In this session we're going to look at creating the foundation for effective operational and strategic leadership. In slide 2 we look at a map which really pulls together all the thoughts we've had on leadership so far in this series. Now, in this program of Leadership in Action, we've attempted to give an overview of the essence of leadership, particularly at the team and operational levels. And these could be said to be the building blocks for strategic leadership. So this slide, this map, sums up on how really thought on leadership has developed. And we can see the great person theories, the qualities approach, the situational approach, the behavioural, contingency, and other approaches as they've developed, leading to the ideas now of sustainable leadership, emotionally intelligent leadership, and a strategic awareness of the context in which the leader is operating. And those 6 areas of culture, connectedness, context, complexity, commitments and capabilities are not just restricted to the strategic level, but actually are relevant to leaders at all levels. They do, however, provide an entry point for all individuals in leadership positions to become more strategic. Now, an important point about this diagram is it's a little bit like an onion with various layers. In the past, we often looked on leadership as a sort of linear flow chart, with the great person approach leading to the qualities approach, leading to the situation, leading to the etc. The problem with that approach was that it suggested that one idea on leadership replaced another. In fact, our thought on leadership is cumulative. So the great person theories and qualities and situation theories are still important today, although we've built these other layers of awareness around the edges. And where we are at this current time is to realize that leaders operate within a framework, and understanding the context that you're operating in, understanding how you link with other people, the culture in which you're operating, handling complexity, and what you're truly committed to and developing capability, these 6 things are now the focus for leaders at all levels. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to the study questions. How tuned in are you to those 6 strategic context areas in the diagram? How do you think those issues will change in the next 5 years? Just give some thought to those questions before moving on to the next slide. Now, in slide 3, we address a very important topical issue in leadership, and that is selecting tomorrow's leaders. Just how do we develop leaders for the future? Leaders who are capable of handling those things, that range of situations including crises, complex management problems and politically sensitive issues. Well, there are some basic issues that we have to consider. Firstly, we have to switch on our antennae and become talent spotters, noticing those people who show a real passion for what they do, for the service that they operate, the products they create, and a passion for developing their people. Secondly, we want people who deliver on both task issues and people issues at the same time, creating teams throughout their organizations with high morale and high performance levels. Thirdly, we want people with good relationship, partnership and networking skills who can develop affiliations with all sorts of organizations and individuals. Fourthly, we want leaders who deliver the results and adhere to the values of the organization. Fifthly, we want leaders who create leadership development opportunities for their people, preparing them to take over various roles as things move forward. And this is where the role of the leader as a coach becomes increasingly important. And then finally, we want leaders who are committed to the developing of people through a positive attitude to coaching and mentoring, not just doing the coaching but having a positive attitude and operating in a management style that builds in coaching and mentoring. This is about getting people to learn from others and to share their knowledge within the organisation. So your study questions for this particular slide are: do you spend time looking for people to develop as leaders? And secondly, what was the process which led to you becoming a leader? Just give some thought to those questions before moving on. Now, moving on to slide 4, we revisit the work of John Adair. In recent years, John Adair has turned his attention to developing strategic leadership ability, and he's produced a 7-point plan to achieve that aim. Firstly, the role of the strategic leader is to provide direction for the organisation as a whole, a much bigger picture than the operational or team leader. And as such, vision, mission and values issues once again become apparent, together with the processes of getting people to buy into those issues. The second point is that the strategic leader needs to get strategy and policy right. And this is invariably more of a wicked problem than a tame one, and it's important that the leader consults widely in order to understand the culture and nature of the organisation in which they're operating. Strategy is important, and it has to be matched by the ability to create results. The concept of making it happen is a good one, and needs to be built into the fabric of the organisational values in order to assure that there is a vibrant culture and climate. A change is always a key issue, and the strategic leader needs to be constantly improving the organisation by organising and reorganising as necessary. Connectedness is included, particularly in terms of relating the organisation to other organisations and society as a whole. Finally, reflecting the spirit of the previous slide, attention needs to be paid to the issue of leadership succession, developing tomorrow's leaders. Now, the armed forces have always excelled at this aspect for a very, very practical set of reasons. And commercial and other types of organisations are now beginning to take this subject very seriously. To find out more about this particular area, look at John Adair's book on effective strategic leadership. So your study questions for slide 4 are the following. To what extent can you employ John Adair's strategic leadership functions in your current job role? Which of the strategic functions will be most important for your next position up the organisational ladder? Now, in slide 5 we address the all-important issue of creating an impact as a leader. Now, throughout history, leaders have invariably been assessed in terms of their ability to impact on others, win hearts and minds, and create results. The idea of leadership impact is one which attracted attention as far back as ancient Greece. In today's world, leadership impact and the ability of the leader to influence the thoughts and behaviours of the led by persuasion rather than coercion is even more important. Aristotle set the scene for the concept of leader impact with his comments that to be a persuasive individual, one needed to have ethos, logos, and pathos. Well, converted into today's language, this becomes credibility, the effective use of logic and language, and understanding the power of emotional impact, perhaps best summed up by the term emotional intelligence. Now, this aspect of leadership impact is reflected in the work of Jay Conger. He's a member of the business faculties of both the University of Southern California and the London Business School. And Jay Conger conducted a 12-year research project with 5 groups of managers in a variety of settings, and he found 4 factors consistently apparent in the operation of those managers who were particularly successful at leading others through persuasion processes. Now, his 4 factors were credibility, the effective use of language, seeing issues from the viewpoints of others, and understanding the emotional frame. And it's interesting to compare his 4 factors with those of Aristotle, created thousands of years ago. Now let's give some thought to our study questions. You might like to actually review J. Conger's article, which is listed in the bibliography, The Necessary Art of Persuasion, published in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago. So let's look at our study questions. Firstly, how would you rate your ability to be persuasive in terms of credibility, logical argument ability, and emotional intelligence skills? Secondly, what action can you take to develop those attributes? And thirdly, how does your answer impact on your leadership development? Just give some thought to those 3 study questions before moving on to the next slide. In slide 6, we move on to a very important issue: creating your own leadership development process. Now, leadership development is not a linear process, and it's up to every leader and potential leader to take charge of their own development. And it's interesting that when Alan Hooper and I carried out our leadership interviews for our book Intelligent Leadership, all the leaders concerned recognized the importance of studying and reading about leadership. And most commented was that if they'd known the contents of many of the books on leadership earlier in their careers, they would have risen to even greater heights. There is no one book, no one leadership model or approach which works for everyone. Leadership development is multivariate and includes processes such as understanding leadership models, experience, exposure to role models and heroes, reflection and observation. And the skills of emotional intelligence are important, particularly that of self-awareness. So give some thought now to your own personal leadership development process. Have you set about constructing your own personal leadership development plan? Which leadership models and approaches do you think suit your personal style and abilities? Now, moving on to slide 7, some years ago the Ministry of Defence in the UK carried out a big study to look at the whole question of what did strategic leaders for the future, particularly in the military, need in the way of strategic thinking skills and strategic people skills, if you like. And one of those things that emerged was this idea that there is 2 strands: things to get the job done, things to keep the people happy. And that's exactly what we saw with the behavioural models. So in slide 7 we see some early thoughts on strategic leadership skills which triggered this research study. And these things actually came out from a number of people who'd been in quite significant strategic military situations, people like Montgomery and various other well-known high-profile individuals. And they talked about strategic leadership as being the ability to see the point in a situation, to see what's really going on here. Secondly, identifying the key issues in a complex situation and sensing the relationships between various factors. The idea of putting 2 and 2 together and making 4 rather than 3 or 5 is a key one that comes out again and again in anecdotal material on strategic leadership. Applying relevant past experience is important. The idea of understanding the difference between ends and means. Does the end justify the means? Standing back and taking the overview, flying up in your mental helicopter or seeing the view from the balcony regularly is very important. Being sensitive to cues to a likely course of action, being aware of those small signals that can herald quite significant events. And then the all-important subject of strategic creativity comes in. So these were things that were going around in conversations and in anecdotal writing and case studies, and these are the sort of things that triggered the Ministry of Defence's interest in the whole issue of strategic leadership. So before moving on to that study, just give some thought to the following study questions. How do you think these thinking skills relate to your current position? in which areas do you think you need to improve? Now remember, this is a very anecdotal, unscientific list, but it's a very appropriate and relevant one for the whole business of strategic leadership. So let's move on and have a look at this Ministry of Defence study. In slide 8, we actually identify the first set of strategic leadership competencies, what is called in the study the thinking skills. In psychological terms, we talk about these as cognitive abilities, but let's keep it simple and just talk in terms of thinking skills. At the top of the list is the whole idea of the importance of knowledge, professional knowledge, political knowledge and general knowledge. And going back into leadership history, remember the idea that authority flows to the one that knows. Secondly, innovation and creativity under pressure. Very important for strategic leaders. And remember, we've already addressed this issue with the idea of cognitive dissonance in the book by Norman Dixon called On the Psychology of Military Incompetence. What seems to happen to people under pressure is that their creative unconscious, the source of all the ideas and strategic thrusts and everything, that tends to shrink under pressure, so they just cannot come up with the ideas. The ability to be creative under pressure is a key ability for the strategic leader. The idea of being able to think through the big picture and appropriate details at the same time is a key issue, and it's one that was probably quite novel when this study came out a few years ago. And the idea is almost like a television director who is in the gallery of a TV studio looking at the big picture on one screen and then relevant details on one or more other little screens. And being able to keep those three things, maybe big picture and two detail issues, actually in your mind at the same time, very, very key strategic ability. The ability to make decisions at the right time rather than immediately, so that you give yourself the opportunity to get as much information and intelligence, is very, very important. And decision making under pressure also brings back this issue of the cognitive dissonance idea, that if you make the decision too quickly and then you find that new information comes in to show you that decision is wrong, then you find that the leader starts to behave in a bizarre way. Making use of intuition is a subject that's come up quite recently, and the idea is that because we've got a very small cognitive sort of conscious mind and an enormous unconscious or subconscious mind, the idea is to let the decision making process be handled by the unconscious or subconscious mind as much as possible. It's a much more powerful computer, if you like the computer analogy of the brain. So if you need to make a decision, don't make it instantly. Let's think about 4 p.m. Thursday afternoon. Think about it, then do other things, and let your unconscious work on that decision. That's what we mean by tapping into intuition, the hunch, the gut feeling. Having a vision and a real clarity of strategic objectives and being able to communicate those is very, very important. Handling complexity, complex concepts, and also uncertainty and ambiguity. And that's where we lead into one of the key skills, one of the key thinking skills, the modern strategic leader, is the idea of scenario planning. Nobody can predict the future precisely, but looking at a range of uncertainties and how these combine to perhaps create 4 or 5 scenarios of possible futures. That's the sort of stuff the modern strategic leader needs to have under their belt. Effective information search, and of course the internet with search engines like Google and so forth, means that the leader has an enormous amount of information at her or his beck and call. And the idea, of course, then is, can the leader sort out the wheat from the chaff? Can the leader sort out the important issues that make the difference? And really, the final thing on our list is the appropriate use of technology. It's easy to think that technology will solve all our problems, but it's a supporting aid, not the be-all and end-all. So, the study questions: how do you think these thinking skills relate to your current position? And in which areas do you think you need to improve? Just give some thought to those questions before moving on to the next slide. In slide 9, we start to look at the second cluster of strategic leadership competencies, what we can call the people skills aspect of strategic leadership. And this is an overview of a very appropriate way of looking at people skills. And one of the interesting ones is the avoidance of the so-called awesome commander syndrome, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, top of the list in terms of people skills is the whole issue of credibility. Do people actually believe in the leader and what the leader can actually offer? Remember, this links back to both Aristotle's ethos, logos and pathos, as well as J. Conger's work, which we saw earlier in this session. So being believable as a leader and impacting people on a personal level, very, very important. Secondly, the thing that sort of differentiates the human race from the rest of the animal kingdom very much is in the area of communication. And so leaders do need to be effective communicators. And that can be handled in a number of ways, not just through e-media, but the visibility of the leader and leaders walking around and seeing people, very, very important. Teamworking and tough empathy, seeing things from other people's viewpoints, but not sympathy, not feeling sorry for them, but being aware of what the world looks like through their eyes is very important. Now we come to this idea of the awesome commander syndrome. Now this used to affect airline personnel on the flight deck in particular, and junior members of the aircrew were often intimidated by strong personalities in senior aircrew and often would avoid pointing out mistakes that, for example, a senior captain might make. This led to a number of tragic air crashes through misjudgment by senior pilots, and today role-play training in aircraft simulators puts junior staff into the position of challenging senior captains who deliberately in the simulator make mistakes for the purpose of training, and the idea is training the younger staff in assertiveness skills to point out these errors. So all that really links into emotional intelligence, and even in the world of the military, the whole issue of emotional intelligence to get the best out of the people is starting to become increasingly significant. In terms of the whole issue of task and relationship style, getting that mix of task relationship according to the situation, very important, and the ability to inspire people hasn't gone away. It's still a key part of leadership in the modern world. Finally, creating a sense of sort of corporate alignment, emotional alignment, and pulling people together is very, very important in a strategic leader is going to operate effectively on these people issues. So your study questions are these. How do these people skills to relate to your current position, and in which areas do you need to improve? Would anyone consider you as an awesome commander, for example? Just give some thought to those questions before we move on. So we reach slide 10, the penultimate slide for this session and for the whole program. This quote is particularly relevant in the modern empowerment world, where we are moving away almost from the celebrity leader, the celebrity CEO, for example, the idea of the leader being the Lone Ranger on the white horse. We're talking now about leaders unlocking human potential. We're talking about leaders impacting people, systems, developing capability. And this quote from the Tao Te Ching, ancient Chinese philosophy, it's not a religion, it's more about a philosophy of the nature of the human condition and the universe. This quote is very, very perceptive in many ways. We've had to paraphrase it slightly to make it politically correct. So, in conclusion, think about this. A leader is best when people barely know that she or he exists. Not so good when people obey and acclaim them. Fail to honour people, they fail to honour you. But of a good leader who talks little, when their work is done, their aims fulfilled, the people will all say, "We did this ourselves." It's a very perceptive quote. It's quite an emotionally loaded quote. And it does bring up the issue of visibility in the early part, where it says, you know, a leader is best when people barely know that she or he exists. Well, we do like the visibility of the leader, and we talk about that. However, this idea of the leader who talks little when their work's done and their aims fulfilled, when the people feel they've done it themselves, that is a key strength on the part of the leader, whether it's a team leader, an operational leader, or a strategic leader. So that's the end of our input material. Before we close the session and the series, let's just have a few words about the bibliography, and this is slide 11, which we're going to be talking about next. So in slide 11 we look briefly at the bibliography for session 10. Firstly, Ralph Stockdale's book, Handbook of Leadership, is an everlasting source of information and thought processes on the nature of leadership and the development of thought. And John Adair's book of Effective Strategic Leadership is very powerful in setting leadership and strategic leadership into a context. David Surrett's Frontiers of Leadership still provides a useful mixture of articles, and a very up-to-date book, Leadership by Richard Daft, that we've already referred to, is a very, very comprehensive text, bringing everything together. A slightly lighter and lighter weight reading of On Becoming a Leader by Warren Bennis, still a good read, still gives you some very useful thoughts on the nature of leadership. And then finally the J. Conger article, The Necessary Art of Persuasion, published in the Harvard Business Review. Very, very interesting thought processes there on becoming a persuasive leader and using the art of persuasion rather than coercion. So that's the end of session 10 of this series of Leadership in Action. It's also the end of the series. It's been a delight to talk through the leadership concepts with you, and I wish you all the best for the future. Take this material, use it, and you will become a more effective leader. Thank you.